So good evening, everyone. While you're enjoying your dinner, I'm going to welcome you to this, our last program of 2017. Oh, we're going to come back again in October of 2017, at least for this season. Welcome, I'm Janet Barnett, the chair for the next maybe 25 minutes of Agenda Alexandria. It's been great, it's been fun. And I want to welcome you tonight to our program. Do we have any elected officials in the room? I didn't see any, but to all those elected officials who are not here, they're going to miss a great debate. So those of you who have served, and I see there's Connie Ring here, and probably some others that give me a shout out. Oh, Frank. Why do I always seem to forget Frank? He's so unforgettable. Anyway, and Paul Friedman? Anyway, all of the elected officials, past or present. Oh, Henry Brooks was on the school board. And Mark Eaton. I know Mark from way back at the Park and Recreation Commission. Okay, I've done this. Okay, enough of this, because each of you has some importance and some impact on the city. So let me move forward and say that tonight brings an ending to a very good year. We're going to say goodbye to some of our outgoing board members, and we're going to have the election of a fine slate of new officers and board members. And for sure, we're going to have a great debate tonight by T.C. Williams students. It also tonight reminds us of Tim Ahern, and I ask that you keep Tim and his family in your thoughts. This year's program was dedicated to Tim, who was to be the chair this year, but as you know, we tragically lost him. So for those of us who work closely with him, those of us who knew him, please keep him in your thoughts and be grateful for the work that he started just over a year ago. I want you to take note of our sponsors. I won't go over them, but they are in your program, and please, please support them, use their products, use their services. They are the folks who are the backbone of Agenda Alexandria, and we appreciate their support. So now I have a few recognitions. We always see these TC students in Velma sort of behind the cameras, behind the microphones. Can you all take a minute and step away from your posts or not? Does it mess it up?
Can we just wave?
You can wave. You can wave. Velma Zephron, can you wave and stand so we can see you? And her colleague, Ben Lyon, just have been, I don't know, there's a lot of superlatives, adjectives I could use, but you know what? They have been very supportive of Agenda Alexandria and have encouraged these young students to come once a month on Monday night to provide us with great sound, and of course they put the show together and put it on YouTube. And, you know, they're dealing with people like I am. Just, can you hear me? Is it okay? You know, I'm not as familiar with some of this stuff as others are, and they've been so patient with us and so kind. And each program, they've gotten better and better. And if you've seen the product on YouTube, I think you would be impressed. So we do have a little few recognitions and appreciation gifts to give you. But since you can't get away from your posts, I'm just going to tell you, each of you is getting a gift card from Starbucks. So before you go to school in the morning, you can stop and get some caffeine. And we have one for Ben Lyon as well. But for Velma, we have... Where are you, Velma? Here you go. Okay, they're going to put it on the table for the show. Thank you, Velma. Please thank Ben, and thank you, students. And I will let you know that they are here in part because of Tim Ahern's efforts. He was the one who called the school to see if we could get the audio-video program involved in our
Agenda Alexandria. Okay, so we also have some other folks that I'd like to bring up on stage. We're saying goodbye to them, but just for the moment, they'll be back. So I'm asking Pam and Donna and David and Bruce to please come up to the stage. Come on down, you guys. These are our outgoing board members, many of whom have served on this board for several years. And I won't go into detail about how well they served, how many years they've served. They've certainly been a pleasure to work with. And, you know, they were going to get like big checks, but we couldn't. Yeah, we did have to tone it down a little. But instead, they're getting proud little ribbons, and they say, "Great job." So you won't get very much for it, I don't think. In any case, on behalf of Agenda Alexandria, thank you so much for your service. Thank you for being a backbone to me as I sort of stepped in a little bit cold, but you all helped me, and I thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, our outgoing board members for Agenda Alexandria. Louis Hoffheimer wanted to do a magic show off with their heads, but you know, I wasn't sure how that would go over, and I just thought, I don't think so. Pam just said one of my better decisions. Okay. At this time, I'm going to turn the program over to Pam St. Clair, who is the chair of our nominating committee, to present the slate of officers for 2017-2018.
Thank you, Janet. Also, we'll point out that there's a couple of board members that are not here. Alice Morgan couldn't come, and she's leaving. And Connie West is also going to be leaving and isn't here. And Regina Nguyen, who have all been very supportive. And just because they're not standing up here doesn't mean that they aren't going to be missed. So, okay. You've all seen the bios of the incoming new board members on the table. We didn't give you the bios of the people that you've elected before, and so I hope you've had a chance to read them. Before I present the slate, I'd like to thank the nominating committee, which was Terry and Janet and Bob, and I think they did a great job. I must say that I'm looking forward to sitting out there in the audience with the other board members while we watch the great programs this new board is going to put together for the next season. So thank you very much. We worked hard to make sure we had the best possible board because we want the best possible programs. I'm going to present the following slate. As I read your name, would you please stand up? Bob Wood for president. Michael Pope for vice chair. Florence King for secretary. She wasn't able to be here. Paul Kentz as treasurer. Thank you. And then Janet Barnett, she says she's leaving, but there is a position called immediate past president. And guess who's in it? Howard Bergman, Katie Cook, Scott Esham. Frank, you're going to be continuing. So, Jenny Franco. I thought she was going to be here, but she's been traveling and she must not have gotten back. Guyla Harris. Mm-hmm. Terry Hauser. Mari Stoll was on a previously scheduled business trip, and she offered to reschedule it, but we said, we're going to put you to work very fast, so get these business trips out of your system and just, come on in. And Mary Frances Varner was also on a previously scheduled trip. So that's the slate that we're presenting.
Thank you, Pam. Are there any nominations from the floor?
Madam Chairman, I move that the slate be nominated by acclamation. No second is necessary.
Well, I've been advised by my acting parliamentarian, my tonight's lawyer, longtime friend, longtime member Gant Redman, that I can call for the question. All those in favor say aye. Congratulations to all of our new members. We are so glad to welcome you to Agenda Alexandria. And before I turn the program over to David, who will introduce the debate team, I would like to call up Bob Wood for just a second. You know, Bob, I don't have a gavel to give you because nobody gave one to me, but, you know, you can just go like that. But in case that doesn't work,
I'm scared.
don't be. It's a good thing.
All right. From the Queen.
The Queen is dead. Long live the King. David, come on up. And we're going to hear from David. He's going to introduce our debate program and enjoy the evening.
Thank you all for being here. So excited about this. I want to first actually thank Bruce Johnson, who as we were discussing this very difficult issue of gun control, came up with and we didn't know how we were going to approach it, who came up with just, I think, fantastic idea, which is to have a debate with real debaters. And so we're very, very excited to have the co-captains of the T.C. Williams debate team, Jay Falk, Victoria Peace, and their coach, Laurel Taylor, who's going to give us a short intro on how debates work and what we're going to see tonight. So let's just come up and get started.
Hello. Thank you so much for having us. This is such a treat for us. We were joking before about how often we kind of debate just to a judge and nobody else is in the room, so it's nice to have an audience that hopefully will smile and nod at us while we talk. Anyway, so a typical policy debate round, which is what we compete in, are two-person teams, and there are two of them, and the speeches go back and forth. There are what are called constructive speeches, where you build your argument, and then there are rebuttals, where you're only allowed to use what you've previously brought up in your debate to kind of solidify your argument. In between the constructive speeches will be cross-examinations, where the person who just spoke is questioned by the person who is the opponent or one of the opposing team members. And so it gives a great opportunity for young debaters especially to really start to think critically about how do arguments come together, how do they compare, where do they clash, where is there overlap, those kinds of things. I often say that debate is not really typically a speech activity when it's policy debate, because you're so focused on critical thinking and analyzing arguments, and you're speaking at a fairly rapid rate because you have a time limit on how long you're allowed to speak. So it's been fun, I think, for these debaters to kind of get into more of a speech approach to debate. So what you'll see tonight is kind of an abbreviated and more audience-friendly version of the debate we do. If you went to a debate tournament, you would hear really fast-talking debaters. You would hear lots of really aggressive conversation, lots of questioning of things. Tonight, hopefully, I think is a little bit more not casual, but a little more friendly debate. So hopefully that'll be enjoyable. Is there a timer? I am the timer, yes. Yeah. So I will cut them off. Okay, so thank you again for having us. Thank you for supporting our debate team and encouraging our young debaters. I'm excited for you to see this tonight. So I'm going to hand it over to you guys.
Good evening, everyone. Before we begin, I would just like to take a moment to thank Ms. Taylor, Agenda Alexandria, and the people who made this evening possible. I'm also indebted to my mother and hero Magnus, who gave me great feedback and advice in preparation for tonight. And I'd also like to thank my fantastic partner, Victoria, who is always debating with brilliance and grace. With that, 2 a.m., June 12th, 2016, the Pulse nightclub. 49 sons, brothers, mothers, and daughters are gunned down. A rifle and pistol found on the gunman's body. 9:30 a.m., December 14th, 2012, Sandy Hook Elementary School. The lives of 20 elementary students and 6 teachers are cut short. 2 pistols are found on the gunman's body. Colorado Springs, 3 dead, 1 gun. Chattanooga, 5 dead, 4 guns. Charleston, 9 dead, 1 gun. The list goes on and on. The night of the Orlando shooting, I walked down to my basement, away from that stifling June heat, and I just cried. I've never been to that club in Orlando. I never knew a single victim, but that human tragedy is unbearable. Why? Why do we lose these lives? Why are so many people being shot and killed with guns? Gun violence in America is a public health crisis. More than 33,000 people were killed by guns in 2013. Of that 33,000, about 21,000 were killed in suicides, and 2,000 were killed in domestic violence disputes. Another 9,000 were killed in all other types of homicide. Given that, today I will deal with these 3 major cases of gun violence: suicide, domestic violence, and crime. I will break down these scenarios and how the prevalence of guns affects them. And finally, I will suggest policy solutions to fix them.
Tonight, I'm not going to tell you something that you haven't heard already. I'm not going to come up with some game-changing revelation that suddenly alters everyone's opinions on this matter. If that were possible, we wouldn't be standing in front of you today, debating a question that has plagued lawmakers and citizens for decades. However, I am going to challenge you to look beyond what we all acknowledge are senseless tragedies committed by evil individuals intent on causing harm to innocent bystanders. Sadly, there are too many of these people in our world. The ones Jay mentioned used a gun. But there are others who have used a bomb, a hijacked airplane, a car, and even chemical weapons. Tonight, I'm going to ask you an important question. How much trust do you have in your government? You may think it's ridiculous of me to ask this because obviously we live in a democracy, but stop for a moment and really think about it. Empirically, we have many reasons to believe that governments do not always act in citizens' best interests. Native Americans suffered the Trail of Tears, being placed on reservations, and most recently, the loss of their land to the Keystone Pipeline. African Americans suffered pro-slavery laws, segregation, and hate crimes that went unpunished for decades. Women were disenfranchised until within the last century, and Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps, all by the US federal government. Our nation was founded on the premise that when governments abuse their power and stop acting in the best interest of their citizens, it is their citizens' right to overthrow them. In order to overthrow them, citizens must have the right to bear arms. While hopefully we will never need to overthrow our government, are you 100% certain what the future will bring? Because I'm not. And while violence should be a last resort to solve problems, it is proven throughout history that sometimes it is the only effective course of action. Guns are an integral part of our society, and placing limitations on them jeopardizes not only our safety, but also our liberty.
So I just asked you a question. Why do we lose so many lives? Well, the first answer is the single largest cause of gun death in America: suicide. Nearly 60% of all gun deaths in the United States are due to suicide, and using a gun is the most common way to commit suicide. According to the Harvard School of Public Health, gun suicides are about 4 times higher for men and 8 times higher for women in states with high gun ownership. All other suicide rates stay exactly the same in those states. Catherine Barber, director of the Harvard Injury Control Research Center Means Matter campaign, summed up this research. She said, I quote, "It is not that gun owners are more suicidal. It is that they are more likely to die in the event that they become suicidal because they are using a gun. This means that when people have greater access to guns without mental health background checks, the likelihood that they will succeed in committing suicide goes up. More guns, more suicide. Although general homicide represents only 30% of the other gun deaths in America, domestic violence is a huge portion of those crime-related deaths. In 2011, almost 60% of all women murdered by guns were killed by a spouse or partner. According to the study through the Johns Hopkins University Center for Gun Policy and Research, when guns are present in a home, domestic violence scenarios are 5 times more likely to result in death. A woman is killed by their domestic partner every 16 hours in America. Domestic violence also plays a massive role in mass shootings. According to findings by Everytown Research, an independent nonprofit nonpartisan organization dedicated to understanding and reducing gun violence, 54% of mass shootings included the murder of a family member or partner of the killer. The final scenario is gun crime and homicide. According to a gun violence study conducted in Chicago, as well as the 1997 and 2004 Bureau of Justice Statistics survey, about 80% of all criminals obtain guns illegally or without a background check. They do this in one of 2 ways: straw purchases from a federally licensed gun dealer, called an FFL, or private transaction, which is either buying or getting a gun as a gift from family or friends. First, straw purchases. Straw purchases are when criminals illegally obtain guns from a licensed dealer, an FFL, by getting someone else to buy and pass the background check for them. This is illegal, but it represents a huge portion of guns obtained by criminals. Picture 2 people enter a gun store. One looks at the cases, tries the feel of a few, and picks out one they seem to like. And then the other person, the straw purchaser, registers and pays for that gun. The other person, the straw purchaser, has their name on the purchase, they pass the background check, but ultimately, that gun is in the hands of the person who didn't pass the background check. The mass shooters at Columbine and San Bernardino both acquired their firearms this way. According to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, known as ATF, about 5% of all FFL dealers sell about 90% of all guns used in crime. This means that only a few gun stores are selling the vast majority of guns used by criminals. Usually, this is because these stores willingly turn the blind eye to obvious straw purchases, or they straight up sell their guns under the table without background checks to make a little extra cash. This is both immoral and deadly. As for private transactions, this method of acquiring a weapon is actually questionably legal. Federal law requires that all FFL dealers conduct background checks on gun sales. But when people acquire a firearm through private purchase, like getting from friends or family, they do not legally have to get a background check. This is known as the private purchase loophole. A recent 2015 study from Harvard's Dr. Azrael of the Injury Control Research Center corroborates a 1996 statistic that suggests about 40% of all gun owners acquired their gun without a background check. In total, Azrael estimates that this means almost 20 million guns are bought each year without a background check. We don't know whether these purchasers are mentally or criminally qualified to own a gun, but they get a gun anyway, and then they go on to use them for domestic violence and other crime. We do not need to be passive observers to this yearly carnage. We can do something to stop this public health crisis of guns killing our friends and our family. We need to establish legal accountability for bad gun shops that facilitate illegal gun purchases, and we need to expand background check requirements for all gun sales that will stop criminals and mentally ill people from getting guns. We need common sense gun reform. The question is, what does that look like? Well, first things first, we can crack down on that 5% of gun shops who facilitate illegal gun trafficking. We need to pass the Equal Access to Justice for Victims of Gun Violence Act. This law would allow law enforcement agencies to hold bad gun dealers accountable for negligence and for product liability when their poor enforcement of background checks and their facilitation of straw purchases makes their guns go to criminals. Next, we need to regulate private gun transfers and ensure that criminals, domestic abusers, and those with mental health history cannot acquire firearms by establishing permit-to-purchase laws and a national gun registry. These things will implement universal background checks and close the private purchase loophole. A national gun registry would require that every gun owner in America have a title on their gun with information about how the gun's changing ownership is kept by the Department of Justice. Permit-to-purchase policy, known as PTP, requires that all gun owners, not just those who buy through a licensed dealer, obtain a permit, which is contingent on passing a background check. How do we know if these solutions work? Well, actually, there's a lot of empirical data that these reforms save lives. First, in 2007, Missouri repealed a PTP law like the one I just described. They saw a 14% increase in murder rate and a 16% increase in firearms suicide associated directly with the repeal. Second, Connecticut implemented a PTP law in 1995, and they saw a 40% reduction in firearm homicide and a 15% reduction in firearm suicide. In addition, that data saw no substitution of suicide through other methods in either state. This means that those who failed to access a firearm because of the PTP law did not commit suicide through another method. 3. In 2000, South Africa implemented assault weapon bans, universal background checks, and gun permits. And in every following year, for 5 years, they saw a 13.6% reduction in firearm homicides. 4. Similar laws were introduced in Australia in 1996 following a mass shooting. The following year, overall firearm death rates decreased by an average 14%. There has not been another mass shooting in Australia since then. 5. According to Everytown research, in states that require a background check for every handgun sale, 38% fewer women are shot to death by intimate partners. 6. Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research found that states with PTP have widely reduced gun deaths, with a 53% reduction in gun suicide and a 48% reduction in gun trafficking to criminals. The evidence doesn't end there. Common sense gun reform is a proven solution to a deadly problem. This debate today will present us with a choice, a life or death decision. Will we take the obvious path to rescue ourselves from a clear and present danger, or will we continue to walk the minefield of death in selfish delusion of personal liberty? I urge you, choose common sense gun reform. Okay, do you want to do it here? Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So now in terms of cross-examination, it's going to be an open period for questions and answers by my opponent. So, first up, I'd like to ask my opponent, do you believe that the attackers in the mass shootings that you mentioned would have abandoned their plan to kill innocents if they had been denied access to a weapon?
So the first thing you need to understand about how gun reduction policy works is that we can't catch every single person who might commit a mass shooting. What we can do is decrease the likelihood that the people who will become dangerous will have access to a gun. We do this through criminal background checks, mental health background checks. Often, mass shooters have mental health history, and so we're able to find them and prevent them from getting guns.
Okay, thank you. Next question, what should be done about the millions of unregistered guns in circulation in the U.S. currently to prevent them from being sold onto the black market? Your crime-reducing policy relies on criminals not being able to obtain guns illegally, so what will be done to ensure that all illegal means of obtaining weapons are stopped?
Well, I think it is important first to understand that gun regulation policy, the idea of it is not to eliminate all illegal guns, because we can't do that. It doesn't happen. But the idea is to eliminate most of the ease with which criminals get illegal guns, and so eliminate some of those illegal guns. In answer to your question about, how are we going to deal with those illegal guns, the way the permit to purchase policy works is that every time guns change hands, the gun will be effectively registered through the United States federal government. So we know who is in possession of that gun, and we are more likely, and they have to pass a background check. So, so these are more, I would say, gateways before people who might become dangerous can get access to the gun.
And how exactly will implementing universal background checks help prevent suicides? Will guns be denied to people who have mentally ill family members?
So no, that's not part of the policy. But the nice thing about background checks and a universal gun registry is that it creates accountability for people who have guns. For example, if someone knows that if the government knows that some person, let's say like Mary Jane, has a registered weapon, and then she leaves it not locked up or in an unsafe position, and then somebody uses it to kill themselves, or somebody uses it in a way that is dangerous, she can be held, for negligence or how she used that gun poorly. And so that actually creates accountability for people to not leave their guns out. I mean, also mental health will protect people from committing suicide.
Okay, thank you.
Checks, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jay, for those thoughtful and thought-provoking remarks. In her speech, my opponent called guns a public health crisis because they kill a large number of people every year. However, cars kill approximately 7,000 more people a year than guns, according to the National Safety Council. And do we consider driving a public health crisis? My opponent also highlights 3 major scenarios of gun violence in America: suicide, domestic violence, and crime. I'm now going to break down each of these categories and examine the role guns really play in them. Suicide and gun use is a very complex issue that needs to be approached carefully and critically. However, it seems strange to be standing up here talking about the methods that people use to commit suicide when so little is being done to address the root causes of it. Ultimately, even if we possibly find a solution to keep every person considering suicide in the US from having access to a gun, are we really doing anything to help them long term? If they are intent on ending their life, won't they eventually find another way to do so? Instead of removing the methods, why aren't we dedicating our resources to helping people deal with their mental illness? It makes more sense to try to cure a mentally ill person than to place them in an environment where they will never have the opportunity to harm themselves. On top of that, despite having the highest gun ownership rate in the world by far, the US is unremarkable in its suicide rate. It does not even rank within the top 10 countries worldwide. Interestingly enough, Japan, which has the highest suicide rate in the world, much higher than that of the US, has passed laws outlawing citizens from owning guns. As you can see, gun ownership is not conducive to more suicide. If it was, wouldn't the US be topping the charts? Logistically, studies from the Mises Institute show that for every age group under 50, there is a higher chance of suicide being committed without a firearm than with a firearm. In 2013, 16,000 suicides were committed using prescription painkillers. That's more than half the amount of people that committed suicide with a gun. Why hasn't anyone focused on doctors giving out prescription pain medication to potentially suicidal individuals? Pro-gun control activists can't claim that imposing harsher regulations on guns will solve the problem of suicides. The only viable solution to this problem is to address the root cause. There are thousands of ways to commit suicide, but there is only one way to stop it. Stop trying to make people incapable of ending their lives, and start trying to help them realize why they shouldn't. As to gun control's link to domestic violence, my opponent first states that 60% of the women murdered by guns were killed by a spouse or a partner. This is a powerful statistic. However, it is not one that explicitly pertains to gun violence. Nowhere does it say that these women would not have been murdered if their partner had not had a gun. Are their victims attacked by baseball bats, maybe a knife, a sharp object, an attacker's bare hands? There is no doubt that domestic violence is a huge issue in our society, but can we be sure that it is one fueled by guns? A study by Pennsylvania State University researchers, based on 9,450 detailed reports of domestic violence, found that a gun was used in less than 4% of the cases. Can we be sure that imposing tighter restrictions on guns can really help the problem of domestic violence? On the flip side of this issue, the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology states that 200,000 women use a gun every year to defend themselves against sexual abuse. In 1967, a safety course which taught Orlando women how to use a gun was highly publicized by the media, resulting in an 88% drop in the rape rate, even though it remained constant throughout the rest of Florida. Guns could be used to help protect victims against attackers, making our society safer as a whole. Last up is crime. I concede that my opponent has a valid point. People buying guns for criminals and mentally ill people is an issue. However, I am unsure of whether it's an issue that imposing harsher regulations on guns can solve. If a criminal really wants to get a gun, he or she is going to get it, regardless of if we are able to stop straw purchases and family-friend gun sales. For one, there is a large black market for guns that is completely unregulated that criminals could easily buy guns off of. In addition, there are already millions of guns in the US, so unless we are going to take back every firearm and re-register it to its original owner, criminals have a wide range of opportunities to get their hands on a weapon. One analogy that fits this particular issue well is the war on drugs. Even though most types of drugs are illegal in the US, thousands of tons are smuggled in across the border every year so addicts can illegally get their fix. In a similar way, if criminals want to obtain guns, they will find a way, regardless of these restrictions. Now, my opponent has provided a policy solution to attempt to crack down on gun violence and gun-related death. First, if passed, it allows law enforcement agencies to hold bad apple gun dealers accountable for negligence and poor enforcement of background checks. In terms of these specific measures, I actually agree with my opponent. We need to stop gun trafficking and letting guns into the hands of criminals. No sane person would argue that it is a good idea to allow the system to keep loopholes that allow guns to end up being used by the wrong people. And this is not a limitation on the guns themselves. This simply regulates gun sellers, and as my opponent mentioned, every other industry in the US is subject to regulations like these. However, it also establishes permit-to-purchase laws and a national gun registry. Let's start by talking about permit-to-purchase laws. Permit-to-purchase laws essentially make it necessary for all people wanting to buy a gun to pass a background check conducted and approved by local police chiefs. There are several problems associated with this, the first of which is that it makes it very easy for certain ethnic, racial, and religious groups to be discriminated against on the bias of their race or religion. The background checks are so decentralized and based on the discretion of certain individuals that it opens the door to many people being wrongfully denied a weapon because of prejudice. Look at what happens to Muslims at airports. They are statistically more likely than any other group to be chosen for extra screening. Or what about racial profiling? African Americans are twice as likely to be arrested after getting pulled over than whites. In fact, one source estimates that 30% of African American males are currently barred from owning a weapon under the federal background check laws due to past criminal activity. A background check that depends on an individual's judgment is not safe and can be used to keep weapons out of the hands of law-abiding citizens because of prejudices. Before moving on, I would also like to talk about how effective universal background checks would be in stopping crime and mass shootings. My opponent claims they are crucial to stopping mass shootings and gun violence, but what if prospective attackers show no signs of being violent? One San Bernardino attacker went through extensive federal background checks and vetting before being admitted to the country on a green card. If she was cleared to enter the country, what makes you think she wouldn't have been cleared to purchase a gun? Finally, let's talk about establishing a national gun registry. Having a registry for guns is terrifying on multiple levels, the first being that it enables the government to have information about which of its citizens are armed, where they live, and other general information about them at all times. One way this could be harmful is that it would allow the government to target and disarm vulnerable populations. Not to draw too close of a comparison, but this was one step in Hitler's rise to power. During Hitler's rise to power, the Nazi Party required all citizens to register their guns. Then, in the weeks before the Night of the Broken Glass, all German Jews were forced to surrender their weapons to policemen. This was to ensure the Jewish people couldn't fight back when their homes, businesses, and places of worship were brutally destroyed. In conclusion, think back to my opening statement. How much trust do you place in our government? Not just today, but in the future. Can you be absolutely certain that Americans should subject their Second Amendment rights to limitation because of the actions of a minority of all gun owners? Think hard, because it could mean the difference between a free and equal society and merciless oppression.
Okay, now we're going to proceed to do cross-examination. So my first question for you is that you offer that we should provide mental illness support and not invest in gun regulation. Why are these two policy solutions mutually exclusive? Is it not worth the lives saved to do both?
So the US federal government has been investing in gun control legislation for decades now. We've passed close to 20,000 different laws on gun control at the state, federal, and local levels. And as we can see, this has not so far been effective in doing anything. So what I'm saying is it's time to try a different approach. Why don't we take the money and the time that we would put into enforcing these policies that have so clearly empirically been proven ineffective and try a different approach? Why don't we try to address the root cause of the problem and not waste our time with something that has been historically proven not to work?
And do your statistics for self-defense account for the increased danger in gun ownership? That's to say, if somebody owns a gun, they might be more likely to be used accidentally and kill someone.
My statistics only account for the thousands of women who have been successful in fending off their attackers by using a gun. My statistics are just simply based on people who have been successful at defending themselves. So no, they don't take into account that risk, but every single one of those cases involved a woman who defended herself effectively using a gun. So,
thank you. And do you believe that if we cannot catch all illegal guns, we should not bother to catch any of them?
I think that this argument is a difficult argument because on one hand, no, we should always keep trying, but on the other hand, there are many more effective ways, for instance, addressing the root cause of problems instead of just trying to keep guns out of the hands of mentally ill people or people who are domestic abusers. So it has been proven that policies like this in the past have been completely ineffective. So all I'm saying is that it's time to take a different course of action. We shouldn't keep repeating the mistakes of our past. And if that involves funneling precious time and money into policies that have already been proven to be ineffective and to have too many loopholes and too many holes in them, then yes, I believe that we should focus on other things.
In her last speech, Victoria presented us with some powerful claims about the scenarios of gun violence. However, a lot of the time, she misunderstands how the statistics and policies function that I suggested. In this speech, I will respond to her queries, question her premises, and finally ask you, the audience, to compare to our two possible worlds. Mine would be a country with common sense regulatory policy and less gun death, while Victoria's world would be the status quo. Victoria's first mistake is in comparing gun violence to other public health crises. She asked us if, considering the equivalent number of deaths resulting from driving and prescription abuse, do we consider these phenomena also to be a public health crisis? The answer is absolutely yes. Policymakers have already created massive amounts of legislations to counter these deaths. In fact, a national car registry, like the one I suggest for guns, exists in America. It's called the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System. Much in the same way we should regulate guns, we already restrict access to cars and prescriptions. Everyone needs a license to drive. Doctors must prescribe any dangerous medication, and the Drug Enforcement Administration is a federal agency dedicated specifically to stopping the misuse of prescriptions. Victoria's apt comparison should make us question why we don't have equivalent legislative safeties in place for guns, considering guns kill almost as many people every single year. Now let's delve into the issue of suicide and domestic violence. Victoria's question for us was this: do people find other ways to commit suicide and commit domestic homicide when they cannot access a gun? The answer is no. In the absence of guns, people do not commit suicide or murder at the same rates of when they do have guns. Also, guns in the hands of an abuser makes domestic violence much more deadly than if the abuser did not have access to a gun. According to Everytown research, quote, over the past 25 years, more intimate partner homicides in the US have been committed with guns than with all other weapons combined. It's because guns are just so deadly. Suicide and domestic violence are often the consequences of a moment of deadly passion. We might have had the same number of suicidal people, and we might have had the same amount of domestic abuse with less guns. But you will also have less gun death, because people cannot murder as easily without a gun. Victoria also makes an interesting comparison to Japan, which has the largest suicide rate in the world, despite gun regulation laws. What she doesn't do, however, is cite a study that compares the United States and Japan. Expert studies, like the ones from Johns Hopkins Center of Gun Policy and Research, like the ones I quote, do a statistical analysis to compare states and countries while controlling for things like population density, urbanization, youth concentration, climate, cultural factors, and many other issues. Without this control, the FBI warns on their website that comparisons like these, like to Japan, provide no insight into the many variables that mold the crime in a particular region and lead to misleading perceptions. In other words, this comparative statistic is meaningless. Unfortunately, while self-defense might be a commonly cited statistic for why we need guns in society, and while those women might feel safer with a gun and believe that their guns defended them from rape or injury or crime, statistics show that these gun-owning women are not actually safer. According to the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, an objective study found that, quote, guns kept in the home are more likely to be involved in a fatal or non-fatal unintentional shooting, criminal assault, or suicide attempt than to be used to injure or kill in self-defense. A study in the American Journal of Epidemiology found that simply the presence of a firearm in the home increases the likelihood of family members dying in homicide by 90%. Are you willing to let your son die accidentally or your daughter commit suicide from your fear of an improbable attack? Now, on to crime. The whole purpose of PTP laws, universal background checks, and gun negligence accountability law is to limit the existence of black market guns. The empirical data show that permit-to-purchase states cut down on illegal gun trafficking almost 50%. This makes sense. When gun shops are held accountable for straw purchases and when private purchase loopholes are closed, the main methods with which criminals obtain guns are made more challenging and illegal. So will criminals keep trying to get guns? Yes, but they'll be less successful. This is why we see a 50% decrease in gun ownership in gun trafficking in states that have higher gun control laws. And this is how you stop criminals from obtaining guns. Do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. No gun regulation law will completely rid society of crime. But empirical data is clear. Common sense gun regulation can save thousands of lives each year. Now I want to address the problem of racial bias in gun permitting, because it's both an important societal problem in and of itself, and it's also an important analysis of permit-to-purchase policy. While local police chiefs make the decision whether or not to approve gun permits, they have a very specific set criteria for what found on a background check makes someone ineligible for gun ownership. This is currently true for background checks in FFL dealers. When police chiefs deny gun permits, they have to cite these background checks and a law that justifies the rejection. The criteria are clear and not really up for subjective discretion. On the other hand, Victoria is right that we do have to be incredibly vigilant to show how our to ask how our policies disproportionately affect certain minority populations. In that vein, to evaluate her argument, it is important to understand that guns are also not equal opportunity killers. Gun violence disproportionately affects Black men. According to the Brookings Institute, 82% of Black gun deaths are homicides, while only 19% of white gun deaths are homicides. What's more, according to the CDC, Black Americans are twice as likely to be killed by a gun than white Americans every single day. For Americans of color, who are vastly overrepresented in gun deaths, sticking to the status quo is much more dangerous and much more discriminatory than enacting gun reform policies. As for Victoria's last analogy to Nazi registration, this is simply an unfortunate case of revisionist history, and it's misplaced in the modern gun control debate. The implication of Victoria's argument is that gun registration enabled the Nazis to target Jews for gun confiscation, and so removed their capability to revolt or defend themselves. According to Alan E. Steinweiss, a Holocaust scholar, I quote, "It is preposterous to argue that the possession of firearms would have enabled resistance against a systematic program of persecution. Failure in the Warsaw Ghetto provides a good example of what happens when ordinary citizens with small arms go up against a well-equipped force. The uprising saved few Jewish lives and had little to no impact on the course of either World War II or the Holocaust," end quote. In other words, even in cases when the Jews had access to firearms, such as in the Warsaw Ghetto, they were unable to successfully revolt. Therefore, the registration of guns was not the defining factor in the victimization of Jews. The Nazis successfully targeted Jews with and without removing their access to guns, just as an oppressive United States government could do. Divorced of problematic historical analogies like this, Victoria left us with two moralistic questions. First, do we trust our government with a gun registry in the face of the need to overthrow it? To answer that, I will remind the audience that this scenario is both alarmist and falls into the classic trap of a slippery slope fallacy. To pretend that a gun registry means that the government will confiscate guns and that freedoms being confiscated is imminent is dishonest. The truth is that government registers and keeps our information in a database for a vast variety of things: cars, births, marriages. This registry does not put our freedoms any more at risk than the current FFL background checks or any of these other registries. And that kind of alarmist rhetoric does not really warrant policy consideration. Second, Victoria asks if we should allow any limitation to our Second Amendment rights. To answer this, I will quote the late conservative Justice Antonin Scalia, who wrote in his anti-gun control Heller decision, quote, "Like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited." He goes on, quote, "Nothing in our opinion should be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places such as schools or government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. The conservative Supreme Court and the current background check laws for the FFL dealers have already determined that background checks and gun regulations do not abridge the Second Amendment. Now it is time to be accountable for these deaths and ensure that we universally implement these regulations that save lives." What this debate comes down to, however, is not the answers to her questions. It's the decision about what kind of future you want for yourself and your children. I remind you not to buy into the illusion that different policy methods of saving lives are mutually exclusive. We can address the root mental illness issues behind suicide, and we can restrict access to the guns that people use to take their own lives. Our greatest strength as Americans is that we do not give up in the face of massive challenges. Gun violence and death may be a massive challenge, but it is one that we can take down and take down today. Let us go out and fulfill our American duty as defenders of the weak and protectors of the defenseless. Let us today protect our children of tomorrow. Let us invest in common sense gun control that will save lives.
In her last speech, my opponent made many excellent points. For the remainder of my speech, I would like to take time to examine her claims step by step and then provide a summary of the arguments made here tonight. First, I would like to address the comparison she drew between driving and gun ownership. She states that driving is absolutely a public health crisis, and that is why we regulate it, and argues we should do the same for guns, given they kill almost the same amount of people per year as cars. However, this reasoning is problematic. For one, the limits we place on drivers have nothing to do with whether or not they are physically capable of driving a car. They have everything to do with whether or not they are physically capable of driving a car, not whether they should be driving one. If we applied the same logic to guns, the only criteria for obtaining a gun would be if you could safely fire one. Driving regulations do not take into account the intent of the driver, which is why they do not parallel gun regulations at all. My opponent's main argument against the points I made regarding suicide in my previous speech is that I fell into a common fallacy known as the substitution theory, the theory that if people don't have access to a gun, they will not commit suicide. Despite what my opponent said about fits of passion and emotion, depression and mental illness are the most common causes of suicide nationwide, and they are not things that go away overnight. Like I said before, simply removing the method and leaving the root cause for suicide untreated is a recipe for disaster. Additionally, my opponent did not present any data or statistics to prove that if a person doesn't have access to a gun, they are less likely to kill themselves. She simply said that in states with higher gun ownership rates, higher gun ownership rates, there are higher suicide rates. And while this is true, there is also a large overlap between states that have high gun ownership rates and states with high levels of poverty and alcoholism. There is no way to know if gun ownership is the single driving factor behind the elevated suicide rates in these states. It could just be one of several societal factors causing this phenomena. A claim that my opponent has repeated twice now in her speeches is that more guns equals more suicide. However, that is where the Japan evidence comes into play. Japan is, again, a country with virtually no guns, and yet their suicide rate is off the charts compared to that of the US. Not to mention, 12 other nations also have suicide rates higher than that of the US. It is not just Japan. Furthermore, my opponent has not provided evidence as to how exactly her proposed policy solutions would keep guns out of the hands of suicidal people. A national gun registry won't address this. Its only purpose is to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and off the black market. The only proposed solution that could possibly have an effect on the rate of people committing suicide with firearms is the universal background checks instituted by permit-to-purchase laws. However, many potentially suicidal people do not show symptoms that would show up on background checks. And would these laws have the power to bar all family and friends of suicidal people from owning guns? That would be what was necessary to be an actually effective solution to this problem. So again, I ask you this question. Why are we trying to take away one of the many methods that people use to commit suicide instead of focusing on early identification, treatment, and recovery initiatives in our communities? Why don't we spend the millions of dollars we would spend enforcing this policy on educating our citizens about the warning signs of suicide and how to prevent it? Now let's talk about domestic violence. My opponent conceded in her previous speech that guns are used in less than 4% of scenarios of domestic violence. This is important because it shows that domestic violence is not a problem that is fueled by access to guns. While my opponent is correct in stating that guns make domestic violence more lethal, I ask of you, why are we okay with thousands of women getting beat up, pushed downstairs, and stabbed by their abusers as long as they don't die? Isn't it more logical to try to identify and apprehend domestic abusers than to make it harder for them to kill their victims? To me, that's just common sense. Why don't we focus on why some men feel it is acceptable to treat women this way? What messages is society sending about women and their bodies that condone this type of violence? Additionally, in response to my opponent's claim that guns can't actually help victims of domestic abuse, I would like to say this. Tell the 200,000 women a year who have defended themselves against sexual abuse with a gun that they would have been safer without it. Tell the Missouri woman who, after being brutally assaulted and raped by an unidentified assailant in her own home, who went on to buy a shotgun and later defend herself against her attacker when he returned to her apartment a week later, that she would have been safer without a gun. Or how about the Texas woman that used a gun to defend her children against an invader? tell her children that they would have been safer if their mother had not owned a gun. And finally, let's discuss crime. My opponent's main misconception here is when she says, when the methods with which criminals obtain guns are made more challenging and illegal, that is how you stop more criminals from obtaining guns. This statement claims that if we make it harder for criminals to obtain guns legally, they will stop trying. However, the logic in this is inherently flawed. Criminals instead are going to turn to easier methods, i.e. the black market, which my opponent conceded exists. In terms of permit-to-purchase background checks being discriminatory, my opponent claims since police chiefs will have federally issued criteria for issuing and denying permits, that no intrinsic bias and racism will come into play. However, do you honestly believe that every single one of the thousands of police chiefs across the country will be able to be held accountable for the permits they decide to issue or not issue? What kind of oversight measures would need to be put in place to make sure that police chiefs weren't abusing their power? And finally, in regard to the example of Hitler using a national gun registry to confiscate the weapons of Jewish citizens, my opponent misunderstands my purpose in citing this example. I am by no means saying that the Jewish people would have been able to effectively resist the Nazis if they had been armed. I am simply saying that this is a historical event that serves as an example of a time when an oppressive government used a gun registry to target and disarm a vulnerable population. Looking at the idea of registering guns as a whole, my opponent argues that since the US government has registries of many other things, such as births, deaths, marriages, and cars, it is just adding one more thing to an already immense list. However, there is something fundamentally different in the US having a list of when all its citizens died, and the US federal government having a list of which of its citizens are actively armed. My opponent calls my rhetoric alarmist and reminiscent of slippery slope arguments. However, there is no problem with sounding an alarm when an alarm needs to be sounded. We should not allow the wool to be pulled over our eyes in regard to future implications of current legislation just because we risk sounding dramatic. Tonight, you have been presented with a lot of information and opinions regarding both sides of the issue of gun control. This is a difficult and controversial issue, and as I said in my original statement, it is not one that has an easy solution. However, I urge you to consider this. The US government has passed 20,000 laws about gun control on the local, state, and federal level since the 80s. We have tried different policy approaches, campaigns, and studies, and yet we still have not been able to solve the problem of gun violence and death. That's because the problem is not with guns, it's with society. Today, my opponent has proposed to add one more act to the already immense library of gun legislation designed to prevent people from owning firearms. In your heart of hearts, do you believe that this is going to have any effect on the problem? Is the answer always more prohibitive and restrictive laws? Or after years of trying to keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people, should we take a step back and address the societal factors that cause this type of violence? Maybe after decades of gun control activists pushing bill after bill through, slowly chipping away at the Second Amendment, but having no real impact on gun deaths, we should try a different approach. What if we took the millions of dollars that my opponent plans to spend on enforcing these regulations and devoted them to helping the mentally ill? Or perhaps setting up programs in communities to help identify and apprehend domestic abusers? There are other solutions to the problem of gun violence and gun death that don't involve limiting citizens' rights to bear arms. We are a nation built on the concept that each and every citizen has the right to many freedoms, including the right to own a gun. Guns are a symbol of the trust our government places in us. There are always going to be people who abuse this trust, but that is unavoidable. Today, we talked about evil people who used guns to wreak havoc on society. But I could stand up here every night for a year and tell you about people who have used other methods to the same purpose. My opponent would argue that if the legislation she proposed helped even a few people, it would be worth it. However, I counter with this. What about the people that it has the potential to hurt? As I mentioned in my previous arguments, letting the government have a registry of all of its armed citizens is a major risk. And the potential for people to use permit-to-purchase background checks to discriminate against certain ethnic and religious minorities is a very real and very tangible threat. When my opponent compares the two worlds of our debate, she makes it sound as if passing her legislation will be earth-shattering. But in reality, it's only a drop in a bucket full to the brim of other gun control legislation. Additionally, she doesn't take into consideration that the tools she thinks she is putting in place to protect innocent citizens could very easily be turned into a tool to harm them and their families. So I ask of you one final question. Do the potential benefits of the policies and solutions suggested by my opponent outweigh the significant and real risks to our safety, security, and personal freedom that I've outlined above? The future direction of our very democracy depends on how you answer.
So that is kind of a shortened, abbreviated version of how a policy debate round would work. In a policy debate competition, you would have a judge, and they would be doing what's called flowing, meaning they would write down one person's arguments and then write the next person's arguments in the next column to see where they compare. And then as the debate would go on, you would kind of narrow down the arguments that the teams were really discussing until you got to maybe 2 or 3 really solid arguments. And then at the end of the round, the judge has to weigh whether the status quo, what Jay mentioned, is better than the world that the affirmative, so that would have been Jay's side, is presenting. And then the judge decides whether a change needs to happen or they should stick with what we already have. So that would be kind of how this would go down in a policy round. But I think now they're going to open it up to questions that are written ahead of time. Okay, I'm going to hit over.
So thank you. I thought that was fantastic. We don't vote at Agenda Alexandria. We don't take sides, but I think we can all agree that they were both fantastic. So we have the other thing we do at Agenda Alexandria is when we ask questions, we ask written questions, so there are pads of paper on each of the tables. And if you have questions, we'll bring them up and ask them. Thank you. Okay, for both of you. What is the criteria for mental health background checks? How is it implemented?
So I can start and say I'm not a public policy expert on this, and I couldn't tell you exactly what would be in the policy. I'm assuming, and I know currently, currently FFL dealers, which are the gun shops that you might go to buy a gun legally, require background checks, and the mental health that they check for is mental health convictions. So when people go to a court of law and they are like a judge qualifies them as mentally ill. That could certainly be expanded in policy solutions if a professional like a psychologist says that someone is mentally ill and not fit to own a gun. But I can't tell you what a policy would specifically include, although it could include any of those things.
In terms of what Jay said, I agree. In my research, I found that when conducting background checks, they look at a person's criminal record mainly above everything else. So if you have a conviction and you've been referred to like a psychiatrist or put in jail or even given a trial where like mental health issues were considered, that will come up on your background check. But yeah, I concur with what you said, and that's what I found.
Okay, thank you. 2 questions. I'll go to the second one first. What about assault weapons and training? Is there any distinction there?
Again, I'll start on this one. So when I was doing my research, there's so much gun control policy that you can talk about, and there's so much like pros and cons of all of it, and I had to kind of pick some that would be useful at preventing gun deaths. So one of the ones that I didn't choose is assault weapon bans. Those were implemented in Australia, I believe, as part of their massive gun reform. It is certainly one that is proposed very often in terms of common sense gun regulation. I don't know that much about it because I didn't include it in my speech, but it is a common discussion.
Yeah, in terms of what Jay said, I think that there are several different debates about the limitations on types of weapons that the public are able to own. I know that a lot of different countries have imposed, like, for instance, a ban on handguns or a ban on assault rifles, weapons of mass destruction, and that's even a hotly debated issue, what constitutes as a weapon of mass destruction. Some people argue that weapons that could be modified to become a weapon of mass destruction should be banned. Some people argue it's just assault rifles, or there's a lot of different criteria that constitute, what could be considered a weapon of mass destruction, and that's mostly what we argue that we should place a limitation on. I think that it's interesting because on both sides, this is an interesting question to bring up, because on both sides of the debate, on both the pro-gun control and anti-gun control, there can be some amount of agreement. Of course, there's a lot of people on the anti-gun control side that would say there should be no limitation at all placed on types of guns, but even on that side, you'll find a lot of arguments that say, or a lot of people that say, yes, we should limit, we should limit assault rifles, or we should at least teach people how to use them before selling them. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting issue, but one we didn't decide to pursue. So
Speaking of that, though, how does training fit into the argument on either side?
I actually think that's a fascinating inclusion into permit to purchase policy that I didn't specifically talk about, but could be kind of revolutionary, because a lot of what we're talking about in terms of gun control safety and when you have a gun, are you using it in a way or keeping it in a way that is safe for your household? A lot of times we don't talk about how people get a gun without actually really knowing what it takes to keep it safe. When I got, to say a little bit of an analogy, when I got my driver's license, they required all people who are underage to go to this, presentation about all the risks associated with driving and whatever it was, along with learning how to drive and all that. And that's not currently required with guns, but I think that if those courses were mandatory to own a gun, you might have a lot more people with better understanding of how to lock up a gun safely, and that could prevent a lot of accidental deaths. I know in my research, and I'm not sure if I included this eventually, but about 505 people are killed through accidental discharge every year, which is not really homicide and it's not suicide, but it's mostly due to people not locking up and keeping their guns safely.
And I think those are really interesting points. And just to argue the flip side of this issue, I think that a lot of people would say you could teach someone how to use a gun, but there is no viable way to make sure, to enforce the fact that they lock up their gun safely in their own home. That is overreach. That's the government coming into your own home and saying, here's how you have to do things. And it's also an issue of whether or not the government could come into your home and check to see if your gun is locked up safely, if you're using it correctly. In terms of the training, I think that it's an interesting issue. I think, again, it's an issue of individual freedom and choice, that people should be able to buy things without the federal government saying that they have to go through training and they have to learn how to keep their weapons safely, especially around children. But I also think it's a really interesting point that I think the analogy to driving is great, because as someone who also just went through driver's ed, I think it's very smart to make sure people are responsible when they're put in charge of the lives of others. And for instance, being on the road or handling a gun, I think that's a really important analogy to make. So,
do you know the basis for the NRA's opposition to safe guns that are linked by, that work based on a fingerprint or a ring to the owner?
I did read some articles about this. I think that I'm not quite sure of the specifics of what the NRA is opposed to, but I do know that the technology is very experimental. right now, and they see it. I believe that one of the reasons is they see it as a way to block people basically from having access to guns, because they'll implement this and it won't be ready for another 20 to 30 years, or won't be ready effectively to use. I think that the problem is it's just very theoretical right now, and there's no guns on the market that actually have these technologies. And perhaps if they started appearing, they would change their stance. But right now, I think it's very much of a just a plan for the distant future. So.
Yeah. I mean, I would also say that, to my knowledge, the NRA's general policy is to oppose anything that would restrict guns. So if a government were to make a law that said you could only own this kind of gun, that in general is going to be opposed by the NRA because they want more access to guns.
Yeah, I agree with that, definitely. I think that that's pretty much a lot of their platforms. So if those guns aren't available on the market right now, then yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think we're gonna wrap up, but I have two questions that relate more to debating than they do to guns. So
We're more experts on that.
The first is how do you address this differently, and by defending an argument that you don't necessarily agree with? And then when you prepare, do you know what the opposing arguments will be?
Do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, okay, I'll start with this one. So I have a lot of experience with arguing, points that I don't necessarily 100% agree with. And I really do believe that it's one of the most enriching things that debate has given me, learning how to see other people's viewpoint, especially in society, in the society that we are in right now, when people are so quick to jump to conclusions and to judge others based on their beliefs, and really just not think over the issue, because they think, no, this is a cut and dried issue, I know where I stand. Maybe they inherit the views from their parents, they adopt the views of their friends, and I think it's so important that the debate program has really taught me to, I love looking at the other sides of issues. I think it's just a great thing, because it's given me such a new perspective on the things that I talk about, and I think that it's made me a more critical person, and just overall a more intelligent person. And personally, it's one of my favorite things to do, to argue the opposition, because I really do feel that it either reaffirms my beliefs, but now I understand even more why I believe them, or it makes me question my beliefs, which is an interesting and enriching experience as well.
I would concur totally. Yeah. In terms of whether or not we got to see each other's speeches beforehand, we did. In most cases, we would not. In most cases, we actually are a team, and so we are debating the same side, and we do not know what the other team from another school is going to say until they say it. But it does allow you to do a little bit more research in preparation to defend or criticize other people's arguments. In terms of defending something you don't agree with, I gotta say, it is the most interesting thing when you're like, I know what I know, and this is just, I'm gonna go in, and you do the research, and you're like, shoot, I was wrong. And you go in, and so I gotta say, at the beginning of this debate, I really did not expect to be wrong, and I don't know that I was wrong on a lot of things when I went in, but one of the things I found was that empirical data is incredibly hard to find and analyze in terms of this kind of public policy, and it's not that cut and dry, not as cut and dry as I made it. So that I think in terms of public policy analysis, when you're not really doing debate back and forth, it's so important to look at that empirical data, and it's something that we don't do enough in terms of informing our own opinions.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. This was terrific.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to bring Bob up for some final words.
Well, I know you gave them a round of applause. Again, I'm Bob Wood. I left my crown with my wife because she owns that. I don't own it. I'm glad to really step in at this point. I can't proceed without pointing out the debate coach, Laurel Taylor, and her students. What a remarkable, remarkable job. And if you didn't happen to look at Laurel when I think it was Victoria was describing why she enjoyed debate, and then the other affirmed it. I think it was affirmed by the other team. I've never seen such beaming pride. And it's very clear. We have 2 juniors here, and T.C. Williams on their way to be great seniors, and really just a remarkable program. It brought to a point exactly what our theme is in this program, in which we take a look at issues without taking sides. And it couldn't have gone better, couldn't have been a better example. Bruce, thank you for this idea you brought to us, and to both Dave and Pam, thank you for organizing the program. Really, really a great thing for us to have. We'll probably do this again. I think we'll solve Middle East peace or something like that the next time this goes on. Really, really a tremendous job. Thanks to a number of people here important to us. Of course, to our outgoing board members, thank you very much for your service. You'll still be with us. We'll still tap you. We know that you'll be supportive throughout, and you'll enlist more members. We're going to grow this coming year because I think the program continues to grow itself under this board and leadership of Janet. I'd like to thank as well our members who are here in the audience. You are really the heartbeat of the organization. We have an opportunity to help organize programs, but you're here in, week out. Next October, we'll have our start of the program yet once again. Thank you very, very much for being here and being... September, okay. In September. Well, we may in fact have also a reception. I'm a new president, and I have to be informed by my, the ex officios here. Thank you very much, in September. To our members, as I said, our audience, thank you very much. To our sponsors, very important to us. They help subsidize, they help keep the program going. They're in the booklet, they're likely in the audience. Thank you very much for what you do to keep our program vital and ongoing. And I must thank Janet. Janet stepped in a tough time. We lost him and his leadership. It was really a difficult time for the program. We're very blessed to have Tim's leadership, his family's involvement, and Janet's leadership. So thank you very much, Janet, for being with us, to rally us when we needed to be rallied, to directing us when we need to be directed, and for handing me the opportunity to take a small charge of a wonderful program. We are going to end now, and thank you for being here. I want to invite, there's homework for 2 sets of people here. The first is our board meeting on 7 June, our new board members. 7 June will be the board meeting at Renner, our normal location, and we'd ask you to be there. It's an 8 to 9 on the 7th. 17 June, we're all going to be involved in an off-site, and that'll be at Marina Towers. We'll be there at 9 o'clock on the 17th. That's a Saturday. We'll look at the program. We'll look at how we can grow, how we can change, what needs to stay the same. And we're looking forward to that program. And the members, you have the next homework. We need to have ideas for the program you'd like to hear. Your ideas are absolutely vital to us. Across your neighborhoods, across your friends, every organization in Alexandria has viewpoints important to this program. So please think about what programs we could bring in a similar fashion, probably not as well argued, but I would offer equally vital to the city of Alexandria. So if you have ideas, turn to one of the members or get it to me or any of the board members. We're happy to consider it. We'll put the program together starting in September. And we're looking forward to having another year of great programs, a great dialogue, and I think an important conversation for Alexandria. So for all of you here tonight, thank you for coming. This concludes the program. And again, let's give our students a hand. Thank you very much.